fire a pistol or something?
What's that? I know.
Well, welcome. I'm Peter Berger, and you'll hear from me for the next hour or so, and then I will stay around, but I will not occupy the center of the stage. I'm very happy the person who comes after me is here, Detlef Pollack, who's at the University of Münster in Germany, and who has a program there on religion and modernity. And what I'm going to talk about here really came out of a meeting there a couple of years ago, where I talked about pluralism. And what we are talking about here is what we've been working on, which I call, maybe with some pretentiousness, a new paradigm on religion and modernity. I wrote a book about this. It came out in last fall, called The Many Altars of Modernity, Toward a Paradigm for modernity, for religion in a pluralist age. And what this is all about, I'll tell you. Let me just preface by saying that, I don't know, speaking of a paradigm seems like an exercise in megalomania, and while academics of my career stage and age tend toward megalomania, and I don't claim to be immune to that disease. It's almost an obligation after a number of years in academia. You should be megalomania. Well, I'm not. I think I'm partly restrained from that disease by having an invincible sense of the ridiculous. And people who claim to have totally new ideas are probably mostly, well, if the ideas are really new, they are not true, and if they are true, they are not new. So obviously this is building on other people. And Detlef Pollack, I think he will explain how we came together originally. But for the moment, let me not tell you funny stories and make funny jokes, or not so funny jokes, and go right into the substance. The word paradigm doesn't have to be megalomaniac at all. It means a conceptual scheme. And we know from famous book that many of you, I'm sure, know, by Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions, quite some years ago now, I forget the date, in which he talking about natural sciences, how one scientific paradigm replaces another. One it takes a lot of time is how the Copernican paradigm of the solar system replaced what came before. Instead of the Earth going around, instead of the sun going around the sun, the Earth, now suddenly the Earth goes around the sun. And how does that change from one paradigm to another takes place? It's very interesting. If you don't know the book, he doesn't talk about social sciences at all, as I recall, but it's very applicable. Old paradigms don't die. They just wither away. And people try to hang on, and then eventually they make a compromise. And Detlef and I made the compromise on a change of paradigm, which now we, I believe, both embrace. When he speaks, he may take it all back and say Bergman is full of shit, but I don't think he will. For many years, including when I started doing sociology of religion, the dominant paradigm was secularization theory, which a lot has been written about it, and its basic proposition is actually rather simple. More modernity means less religion. And everyone, when I started out, took this for granted. There were a few exceptions, like Andrew Greeley, who had a book which begins with a wonderful sentence: "The state of religion in society has not changed substantially since the Stone Age." Interesting proposition. I think totally false, but he resisted this. I think he still does. He still writes a lot. when I started out, I took this for granted. Everyone else did around me. And it wasn't crazy. There were reasons for thinking this. It also happened to be very Eurocentric. If it's true of any part of the world, it's true of Europe. It's certainly not true of the United States. And it's true of almost anywhere else, maybe Australia. I don't know much about Australia. It took me about 20 years to come to the conclusion that this doesn't hold up empirically. And it had nothing to do with any change in my own personal beliefs or lack of beliefs. I think I would have come to the same conclusion if I'd been an atheist or a Buddhist or a Jew or something else than what I am, which is a theologically liberal Lutheran. It had nothing to do with this. If you read my early work on this, you couldn't tell. So I think it was very much a change of mind based on empirical grounds. Now, if one paradigm has to be abandoned, what is to replace it? And I concluded some time ago the most likely successor is a paradigm, a theory based on pluralism. I realized early on that pluralism is important. I didn't realize how important it is. And I think it's, as a general concept, the central concept of a general theory of religion and modernity, pluralism is a much better choice than secularity. Okay, this is by way of introduction. Now, if the basic thesis of secularization theory was that, how did I put it, the more modernity, the less religion, which means it's a basic antagonism, which many people still share, including theologians and social scientists, historians, whatever. I think that's the wrong way of putting it. There are some people who are exclusively secular. I don't know, Swedish sociology professor for me is a kind of epitome. And there are others who are completely religious. I mean, I guess the epitome would be a Russian monk who performs the Jesus prayer every moment he's awake. Lord Jesus, have pity on me, a poor sinner. Unless he's sleeping, he keeps repeating this. Must be rather dreary. But for most people who profess some kind of religious faith, this is not an either-or. It's a both-and. Is this possible? Yes, it is possible. For the last few years, 3 times a year, I've been teaching at the Baptist University in Central Texas. And if you believe that one can't be modern and be religious, spend a few weeks in Waco, Texas, where Baylor University is located. And you'll meet petroleum engineers and IT specialists and other totally modern people, economically successful and highly scientific in what they do, who believe that you can stop a hurricane with prayer and the world is 6,000 years old. The question is not, can this be done? Nor is the question, at least for a sociologist, who is right in all of this? It's not a sociological question. God is not available for survey research. But so the question is not, can this be done? We know it can be done. The question is, how is it done? And this is what has fascinated me for a few years now. Well, let me come back to the, get to the question of how it is done, get to the Russian monk. Let's assume he's a motorized monk. He drives a car, and he's skipping on ice. He has to get the car back on the road. At that moment, he has to stop his Jesus prayer. Or at least, even if he mechanically repeats it, his mind has to be attentive to other issues. And if he gets the car back on the road, he is applying some kind of manipulation of modern technology. That is perhaps too far-fetched an example. Let me take a less far-fetched example. I know in Boston, in fact, he did a cataract surgery on me a few years ago, who's a very good doctor, an eye surgeon, and a very observant Orthodox Jew. In fact, he wears a yarmulke in his office, and he's a good doctor. I can still see. I can't walk very well right now, but I can see very well, better than before. And I've watched him with other patients. He's extremely warm. He's interested in people. He's the kind of doctor you want to have. But when he performs surgery, and I've seen him do it, he did it on me, he wears a cap, a surgical cap. You can't tell whether he's wearing a yarmulke. And when he performs the surgery, he must operate within a frame of reference, which has nothing to do with his being an Orthodox Jew. You cannot do surgery, modern surgery, based on some Talmudic text. Even if his patient were a fellow believer, he can't do it either. And if he did it, his Orthodox fellow believer would sue him. Can he do this? Yes, he can do it. And lots of people can do it. I won't continue with examples. You can make up your own examples. How is it done? And what are possible building blocks for a theory that will describe how it is done? And one concept which I find extremely useful, and Silke Stetz, who's here from Germany, has written about this, a concept that's very useful is Alfred Schütz's concept of relevant structure. We operate with different relevant structures. Let me give you an example. And modern people have to operate with more relevant structures just because society has become very complex. And you have to be one thing in the morning and something else in the afternoon, and you have to switch. Relevant structure. Let me one example. I mentioned it in the book, but I cannot assume everyone has read my book. You should, but you haven't. You're in a picture gallery, okay? Not a museum, a picture gallery. And you stand before a picture which really grabs you. You have, in other words, you have a strong aesthetic experience. A good painting can do that for you. And then you happen to notice, it's a gallery, not a museum, there is a price attached to the frame. It's for sale. And you look at the price, and you look at the picture, and you say, gee, this might be a good investment. What have you done in that moment? You have switched from an aesthetic to a financial relevance. We do this all the time. And it should not be surprising that religion falls in the same dynamic. Now, some of you here I know are theologians of one sort or another, and I know immediately what goes through your mind, but isn't religion supposed to cover everything? Yes, as what Tillich called ultimate concern, as a final interpretation of the cosmos, of human destiny. But you don't think about this all the time. If you thought about this all the time, you couldn't do surgery, you couldn't drive a car, lots of things you couldn't do. Again, you switch relevance. And even great theologians may be politically active, and this may not involve their religion. They do a number of other things, and they switch back and forth. I could give you 100 funny examples, but I won't get to say anything else if I start giving you examples on this. What does this have to do with pluralism? In other words, one of the relevant structures in which everyone in the modern world must operate or he can't function. Not just surgeons, but his patients as well, and everyone else, regardless of faith, color, creed, or whatever. But that secular discourse, which is inevitable in a modern society, and which we must cope with, whoever we are, does not totally dominate. even for eye surgeons and very few other people, including Swedish sociology professors. What is that secular discourse like? It's part of pluralism because it coexists with religious relevant structures. That's why the name of this conference, by the way, Kimon Sargent, thank you very much. He's paying for it, named the Templeton Foundation. We called it the two pluralisms. What are the two pluralisms? Both is what most people mean when they speak of pluralism. It's the coexistence of different religions in one society with more or less civic peace. Obviously, if they kill each other, nothing happens intellectually or cognitively between them. But the coexistence of different religions in one society is most people mean by pluralism and has an enormous effect, and I will talk about the various effects. But there's also a pluralism between the secular discourse, which must exist, and the various religious discourses. So it becomes a little complicated, and neither secularization theory as it existed before Detlef Pollack, let's say, and secularization theory, which and the or non-secularization theory, the critics of secularization theory, who've talked about the return of the sacred, return of the gods, things like this, that isn't quite correct either. The two things are happening simultaneously, and they interact. And the interaction between secularity and the religious between the secular discourse and the religious discourses is terribly important to understand how it happens. Now, if you want to understand what the secular discourse is, one person I only came across in the last couple of years I find very interesting is Hugo Grotius, Dutch jurist in the 17th century, one of the fathers of modern international law. And he had a famous, I don't think he wrote in Latin, but the phrase was in Latin. Maybe he wrote in Latin, 17th century. He did. Jared Mueller knows all about history, including all the details of Hugo Grotius. The Latin phrase he used, we must do international law, the kind he wanted to develop, etsi Deus non daretur, as if God were not given. In other words, as if God did not exist. Now, he had no alternative, by the way. This was a period in which, in Europe alone, you had Catholic states, Lutheran states, Anglican states, Calvinist states. You had also the Russian Empire, and you had the Ottoman Empire, all within Europe. International law, you couldn't have a religious discourse of any one of these groups. Impossible. It had to be religiously neutral, as if God did not exist. Now, this sounds like an atheist statement, and Grotius, very interesting, was not an atheist at all. He was a pious Protestant who was anti-Calvinist. He rejected the Calvinist doctrine of double predestination, which I think he was right. I would agree with him. But he had big trouble because of this. The Calvinists ran the newly independent Netherlands, and they kicked him out. He went to Germany, and then I think he died in England, where other Protestant regimes were more tolerant of non-Calvinists. So it was not a philosophical atheism. It was an epistemological, methodological atheism. And that is the atheism, if you want to use that term, which is a misnomer. But that is the secularity which must dominate the secular discourse. I have time. I deliberately, when we planned this conference, said it must be a leisurely conference, not like a Japanese railway schedule. So we gave Pollack and me 3 hours this morning, including a lot of time that you can fill, questions, objections, other ideas. An example I love to illustrate how this happens comes from Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud, the founder of the modern Saudi state, when he conquered the Hijaz, the area of Mecca and Medina, he wanted to establish a telephone line, this was in the 1920s, between the capital, Riyadh, and the center of Arabia, and the port of Jeddah on the Red Sea. And the Muslim imams, clergy, whatever you want to call them, who still more or less run the ideology of the Saudi state, said you can't do that. The telephone is an instrument of the devil. Well, Ibn Saud was a very pious Muslim, but he didn't believe that the telephone was an instrument of the devil. What he did was very simple and very clever. He had established a telephone line, and he had one guy in Jeddah read from the Quran, and he had some of his mullahs listen on the other side in Riyadh. And then Ibn Saud said, look, this can't be an instrument of the devil, otherwise it couldn't carry the words of Scripture. And they agreed. So now you can telephone Boston from either Jeddah or Riyadh. That is the second pluralism. And Saudi Arabia doesn't have much of the first. No other religion except their version of Sunni Islam is permitted within the kingdom. But they do have a secular discourse. They have an airline. They have modern hospitals. And they have computers and everything else, not just telephones. Well, they certainly would see a contradiction between their ideology and modern secular philosophies. Excuse me, sorry, I misspoke. Other religions, that's not permissible. But the secularity discourse is very permissible if it does not interfere with Islam. That description of the second pluralism can easily be expanded to any number of countries, any number of religious traditions. Now, what is the effect of pluralism on individual people, their consciousness, and the place of religion in that consciousness? And that, I think, I would describe as follows, and there again, Alfred Schütz is quite relevant. It's through much of human history, though some historians will say this shouldn't be exaggerated, a basic tradition not only had a monopoly within the state or the society and was enforced by the authorities, but it was taken for granted within the consciousness of most people. You were, by nature, inevitably, you were a Catholic or a Buddhist or wherever you happened to be born. I read somewhere that in ancient Greece, when two strangers met and they wanted to know where they were from, a favorite question was, what are your gods? If you came from Athens, you had a set of gods. If you came from Corinth, you had another set of gods. It was like today, what's your zip code? It was taken for granted. Now, there were some people who would question it. Certainly, always people like Socrates and people who questioned it on less sophisticated grounds than Socrates. But it was taken for granted. In other words, there is a high degree of certainty in traditional pre-modern societies. I would stick with that, although one shouldn't absolutize it. There are always skeptics. But most people were not. Today, that's very difficult. Religious certainty is not easily obtained. It is always surrounded by a penumbra of doubts and skepticism. And the individual who has religion has to make a decision to have faith. Very interesting. Has enormous implications. And in case you think what I'm talking about is too abstract, let me give you a central example of the sociology of contemporary religion. The fastest growing religious movement in the world is evangelical Protestantism, mostly in its Pentecostal form. What is characteristic of this type of religion? you cannot be born a Christian. You have to make a personal decision to use their language. It's not my language. You have to accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. Nothing could be more modern than that. You can't take it for granted. You can't just be a Christian because your parents were Christians. You must be born again as a Christian. It's a very modern phenomenon and has enormous implications. And I think, I don't know, I'm not a historian, but I think evangelical Protestantism is not only the fastest growing religious movement in the world today, it's probably the fastest growing movement in human history. And why it's growing so fast is easy. It's modern communications. You have South Korean television programs that try to break it to China, and then do Protestant ones, and so on. No single religious discourse can be taken for granted very easily. It has to be chosen. Enormous implications for the individual. Now, there's a lot of talk today, people who believe, well, I believe, not a question of belief, people who use a lot of survey research have coined this wonderful phrase, the nuns. Not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. That is, people, English-speaking people, who answer questionnaires, what's your religious affiliation? They say, none, I don't have any religious affiliation. We have some research on these people. Very interesting. Who are these people? It's a very heterogeneous group. Why they have no religious affiliation and what they have instead, if anything. I think the more interesting research, and I don't know of any, maybe Linda Woodhead does, is the people who say, not I have no affiliation, but who say, I'm Catholic, but. I'd like to have more research on the buts, because I think there are much more of them than the nuns. Yeah, they still have some, whatever it is they originally had. But they don't believe this, they don't believe that, they don't like the clergy, or whatever. Okay, enough of this. Effect on the individual. What is the effect of pluralism on religious institutions? Use the Christian term, churches would apply to anybody, mosques, synagogues, whatever. What's the effect on them? Well, whether they like it or not, they become voluntary associations. Or more carefully defined, if pluralism is combined with a measure of religious freedom, then they become voluntary associations, even if this contradicts their theology, their theological self-understanding. And I think the most important case, at least the most significant case of this, is the Roman Catholic Church. If you look at the 100 years between the First Vatican Council and the Second Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council was convened by Pius IX, also the author of a wonderful book called The Syllabus of Errors, which was based on the notion, basically, that error has no right, no rights. And the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is the only religious body which has the fullness of truth. You might acknowledge that, I don't know, Presbyterians and Buddhists have some elements of truth, but the fullness of truth is the Roman Catholic Church. And therefore, those who, well, error has no rights. They may be tolerated, but there are no rights. The Second Vatican Council, which was convened by John the 23rd, who, John the 23rd, I think, right. Yes, who called for an aggiornamento, accommodating the church to the modern world. Well, the Second Vatican Council declared solemnly that religious freedom is a basic human right, not just for Catholics, for everybody, including atheists, have the right to be atheists. Actually, a very good formulation of why this is so, not in theological terms, but philosophical terms. Okay, one can go on with this. So even the Roman Catholic Church, which still basically says they only have the fullness of truth, but religious freedom is an absolute right, perhaps the fundamental right. If you combine that with pluralism, what you have is one of my favorite visual experiences of pluralism is in Hawaii, one of my favorite places on earth, especially this time of the year. If you know the Pali Highway, which leads from Honolulu to the north of the island of Oahu, and has on it every religion on earth, not just the major Christian denominations. There is a mosque, as far as I know. There's a synagogue, if not on it, near it. But there are all kinds of Asian religions, Buddhist, Hindu temple. There's a Vietnamese church. I don't know what it is, some kind of Vietnamese sect. And they all live together, and they say aloha. That is the combination of pluralism and religious freedom. Now, we know that doesn't exist anywhere in the world today, but where it does exist, it forces, whether they like it or not, the different religious groups to go through the process that the Catholic Church did in this 100-year period, almost exactly 100 years between the two councils. I remember when I was very young at the time when the council was convened. I had a Protestant pastor who was my mentor in some ways and is not known at all today. And I asked him what he thought the Second Vatican Council would do. And he said the first thing they will do is they will not read the minutes of the last meeting. It was a very good prediction. Okay, enough of religious institutions. Voluntary associations, and what is a good building block of that aspect of the paradigm? I think it comes from Richard Niebuhr, American church historian, much less well known than his brother Reinhold Niebuhr, a very famous theologian. I think Richard Niebuhr is more interesting. He was a historian, church historian, teaching at Yale. And he wrote a book in 1929, The Social Sources of Denominationalism, still worth reading. And he quarreled with what was until then a predominant category to distinguish religious groups, church and sect. Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch were very influential in making that distinction correctly. And the basic assumption was a church, you're born into it, it's a broad tent. A sect, you have to join, and you have a tightly knit group of believers. And Niebuhr suggested that the denomination is a middle category. And Weber didn't have that category, so his book about American Protestantism is The Sects, I forget the exact title, The Sects and the Protestant Ethic. And he called all Protestant groups in the United States sects because it met his category. He didn't include the Catholic Church, but it's absurd. I mean, you have churches with millions of people, like Methodist Church or the Baptist, but people are born into that denomination. No, it's a denomination. And he defined a denomination as, I think I have it pretty accurately in my memory, as a church that acknowledges the right of other churches to exist. Very interesting. So what pluralism means here could be described as a global denominalization. I'm not suggesting this is a useful concept to use. Everyone becomes a denomination if pluralism is combined with religious freedom. Okay. What have I left out? Left out a couple things. Well, then you want to ask, what is the effect of this on the state? And that's very interesting. And I got money from two curious sources. Not Templeton, I regret to say. No, Templeton is paying for something else in the fall, which is they wanted a conference on the topic for students. So we're going to have a conference for college students about the two pluralisms at, of all places, the Harvard Law School, because the Kennedy School is reluctant to allow other people to use their wonderful meeting place. What about the state? How does the state manage the religious pluralism? Very interesting question. Is there only one kind of religious freedom, or are there different ones? I'll come to this in a moment. Still have a moment. And then how does the state define itself in religious terms? That's very interesting. And therefore, we're having the conference in Washington at the center, I forget what it's called, on religion, world affairs, something like that, at Georgetown. Let me concretize this again. The American government, by act of Congress, is obliged to advocate religious freedom all over the world. And there are 3 agencies of the federal government that deal with this. There is the ambassador for religious freedom, who's in the White House, recently been appointed. The Obama administration wasn't very much in a hurry to appoint this person. And they've now appointed, I don't know him, I understand he's a very interesting man, Rabbi Saperstein, who apparently was very active in various Jewish organizations. I think he's a conservative rabbi. And very much concerned with religious freedom. Apparently a good choice. Then the State Department, and that becomes kind of surreal, I think, has a Bureau of Religious Freedom, which has to have a separate report on religious freedom in every country of the world, separate from the annual report on human rights, which is separate. So you have 2 processes going on within the State Department. There's an incredible chutzpah in this, by the way. I mean, if you ever read the human rights reports, which I think on the whole are not too unfair. I mean, they are criticisms, but they report fairly honestly, both on our friends and our enemies. Not completely honestly, but Saudi Arabia gets negative ground. Of course, there's China and Iran and so forth. Why is this chutzpah? If you read these reports, there's a usual phrase, such and such a country, well, Switzerland, for example, it only has 3 lines. Switzerland is a democracy in which the rule of law applies. That's the human rights report. There are no recorded instances of, and then there's a list, genocide, torture in prisons, whatever, long list. And I once heard a Swiss diplomat who talked about this and said, who the hell are you to give us a grade of A? Now, of course, the Swiss, you prefer getting a grade of A than getting a grade of F, which Saudi Arabia should get. Okay, that's the State Department. There's also something called the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is tax-supported, but is not an agency of government. They have a complicated way in which people are appointed to this, but it's pretty interfaith. Everyone is there, more or less, major groups. And they write reports on what they call countries of concern, where there are significant violations of religious freedom, and they write this up in the report to the Congress and to the President, who basically, as far as I say, put it in a drawer and do nothing about it. But I love that phrase, country of concern. And the question I want to raise at the Washington conference, which you can raise in any democracy, certainly it's very relevant to European democracies. What does a country have to do not to be a country of concern? And that's very interesting. And I look at Linda, so I think of England. And what about England? The Church of England, the Queen is the head of the Church of England. The bishops, as far as I know, still sit in the House of Lords. The Church of England gets various privileges. I don't think they get direct funding from the government, but they have all kinds of benefits. Is the United Kingdom, or even England, a country of concern for the United States? You'd have to be crazy to argue that. It's in there? Well, it'd be very low down. I mean, there is as much, in fact, as much religious freedom in the United Kingdom as there is in the US or in France or in Germany. But very different definitions of religious freedom. In France, laïc government of France pays for the salaries of teachers in religious schools unconstitutional in the United States. In the Netherlands, in Germany, again, you have different things. But I think these countries should not be of concern if your interest is religious freedom. What about Russia? And the way Russia is going now is, I think, should be of concern to people who are interested in religious freedom. And the head of the Russian church, who's the Patriarch of Moscow, is playing a very dubious role with being in bed with the Putin regime. And do a little mental exercise. Imagine that the Moscow Patriarch would deal with society as the Archbishop of Canterbury deals with it today, which is possible to imagine. I don't know how likely it is politically, but still emphasize Orthodoxy is the traditional religion of Russia, and it should be some kind of at least symbolic privileged status in Russia. But there's freedom of religion for everyone else. I don't think it will be a country of concern. And what I would like to discuss, not so much in terms of US policy, which other countries, at least other democracies, have similar issues. What is our understanding of religious freedom? And if you look at it through American eyes, there are Americans. I had a very brilliant law student who was a fanatical believer in the First Amendment of the US Constitution. She thought everyone should have it, more or less like the American Constitution. Well, that's not going to happen. It's very unlikely, for example, that any Muslim majority country is going to use the First Amendment translated into Arabic or, I don't know, any other language you can imagine. So what are the possibilities, the possible definitions of religious freedom in a democratic and pluralistic society? Well, I think on this I will end, except those of you who know me, it's very difficult for me to talk for, what if I talked about 50 minutes, 45 minutes without telling a joke? So I'll tell you the pluralist joke. And jokes have no copyright, and you can tell it to anyone you like. It's about a holy man, a god man as they call him in India, who sits somewhere in the Himalayas in a lotus position in a trance. And there's a young American who visits him. And an American sits down and says, "Sir, I come from the United States. I'm in the search of the meaning of life, and I understand you know it. Could you please tell me?" And the holy man, who's looking at the distant peaks of the Himalayas, says, "The meaning of life is in the lotus flower." The American doesn't say anything, puzzles over this. And the holy man tears his eyes away from the distant peaks and looks at the American, frowns, and says, "Do you have any other suggestions?" I think that is the joke for pluralism, and I think I will end more or less on time. Now, I talked with Detlef about how we should handle this should be opened up to the public here, and we gave ourselves 3 hours, so it can be very leisurely. And he thought we should have it in 2 stages, after I talk and after he talks, and then all of us will have enough. So I'll open it up for discussion. You want to say something? No?
I'm just going to set up the presentation for the next bit.
Do you want to stand or you want to sit? We have a microphone. I'll give you this microphone anyway.
Okay. Anyone have any comments?
Oh, you're going to chair this. Good.
No, but
Okay. Do you have any other suggestions? Sure.
This is the comment. It's something I'd like to talk more about that you discuss in the book, and it seems to me one of the many great issues. And that's the difference in mentality between between traditionalism and neo-traditionalism.
Yes.
Various faiths. Claim is a result of living in a situation of pluralism and relativization.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could say a bit about that.
Traditionalism, in its ideal typical form, fosters certainty. Neo-traditionalism tries to reimpose certainty, and it's very difficult under modern conditions. And the neo is very crucial. And I can tell, not a joke, but a true story which illustrates this. The wife of Napoleon III had a very debatable background. She was a kind of elegant call girl before Napoleon III picked her up. And when Napoleon was the third, not a big Napoleon, a little Napoleon, was on a state visit to England. And Queen Victoria was the monarch at the time, and her job was to take, what was her name? Eugenie, I think. Was Eugenie? To the opera. And she was still quite young, Victoria, and they were both very impressive-looking women. And they went to the opera, I think Covent Garden Opera, I think, and since the guest was allowed to go first. So Eugenie went in, and people applauded, and she graciously nodded at them, looked behind her, and very elegantly sat down on the chair. Then Victoria came in. Again, people applauded, and she nodded to the populace and sat down. She didn't look back. She knew the chair would be there. They wouldn't let her fall on her behind. Eugenie wasn't quite sure. She had to look. That is the difference between tradition and neo-traditionalism. And it's difficult to do in a modern society. And people who try it have a difficult time. There are geographical experiments like the Amish or Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, communities. And if you can't do that, you have to, if you can't isolate people and then everyone there can be more or less, if you grow up and talk to many other people, you can have a kind of tradition. But it's difficult because the outside world keeps impinging on this little paradise you've created. But there was a very good book has just been written on this, you may know it, Jerry, by a sociologist at, where is she? University of Kansas. At the moment I forget her name. It's called Becoming Unorthodox. It's the sociological studies of the kind of thing I just mentioned, Hasidic communities in Brooklyn. And people who want to leave it. And how difficult it is and what they... It depends, it's autobiographical. I don't know her, but I read the book. Very interesting sociological study. That's the difference between neo-traditionalism and tradition. Taken for grantedness, which was Schütz had a wonderful phrase, the world taken for granted. I think somebody back there wanted... Yes, sir.
The example you gave about Saudi Arabia and the South, the adoption of technology.
I can hear you.
The adoption of technology by, say, religious people. Is it necessarily a move towards secularism?
No. That's the point I was trying to make. Go to Waco, Texas. You have to go to Saudi Arabia.
But aren't there any implications for mass adoption of technology towards some possibility of some form of
Yes.
civilization creeping in?
Yes. Yes, you have access to a computer, you have access to the internet, you can connect with every ideology in the world. No, I agree, that's true. But it's not technology as such, it's the communication that results from it.
conversations take place in the public square with this new pluralism? So, for example, should all these different groups agree on a single language that we're only going to talk about reason, we're not going to make reference to the Bible or the Quran? Or should they try to be multilingual, saying, what does Khan say, what does the Quran say, the Talmud, the Christian, or the Bible say?
Well, that's the problem of where's Wolfram over here. What's the nature of interreligious or interfaith dialogue, which is not an easy task. And look, it has a very interesting effect on religious communities, which, let me not make evaluative statements, I will describe it. It does something very interesting. If it goes on, if that conversation goes on, well, one concept I use, very relevant to some of this, is cognitive contamination. If people start talking to each other, they begin to influence each other. We have studies for children, we have all kinds of studies, child psychology, and they start making compromises. Now, with interreligious dialogue, you're dealing with issues where people who believe something religiously have deep commitments. So it isn't very easy to make compromises between Islam and, I don't know, Methodism. So people who are at all reflective, and most people are not, but they have to decide what is negotiable about their tradition from which they come, and what is not negotiable. Okay? Let's take a Christian example. I'm sure you can take examples from any tradition. One of the big crises in Protestant theological thought in the 19th century came from the application of modern biblical scholarship to the Bible. Old and New Testament, but the New Testament worried these Protestants more. So I think there was a broad consensus developed that the resurrection of Jesus was not negotiable. Now, what it meant, there were different interpretations. Was there an empty tomb or not? What was the nature of the body of the resurrected Jesus? What does it mean for the rest of us? Okay, that's another question. But the fact that the basic proposition that Jesus Christ rose from the dead is not negotiable. And famous passage in one of Paul's letters that if Christ did not rise, our faith is in vain. But that doesn't extend to all the miracles of the New Testament. Did Jesus walk on the water on the Lake of Galilee? Maybe yes, maybe no. It is not the core of the faith. If necessary, we can give this up. Now, that exercise is a very interesting exercise. I think a very useful one. And there was a school of religious scholarship in Sweden in the 1930s and 1940s. And they did what they called motif research. Interesting term, musical motifs. What are the central motifs of a tradition? And then you get all kinds of agglomerations, historical accidents, influences of one sort or another. Which is which? A question, by the way, of burning importance today in the Muslim world. Modern historical scholarship for Orthodox Muslims of any kind is haram when applied to the, forbidden when it applied to the Quran. Yet if you look at it with any kind of modern historical perspective, there are very significant differences between the chapters of the Quran that came from the Mecca period of the Prophet and those from the Medina period. Understandable difference. In Mecca, Muhammad was a prophet, persecuted, in danger of his life, had to flee. In Medina, he became head of state and military commander. Very different situation. From a liberal point of view, all the good passages of the Quran come from the Mecca period. The more debatable one comes from the Medina period. That's not allowed in terms of Orthodox Islamic thought. I'm not making a value judgment here, but descriptively, my job here. It'll be very important for the future of Islam and its relationship to societies, whether that continues to be the prevailing approach, or whether it'll be possible to say, well, we can disregard some particularly bloody passage from the Quran if it comes from probably comes from the Medina period. That's not core. That's not the motif that we have to carry on. Basic motif is different. Muhammad was the prophet of God, and somehow the Quran conveyed divine revelation. But that doesn't mean that every surah is inerrant, to use a Christian term that doesn't quite apply to Islam, but it does apply. I think you could say inerrancy of the Quran, of every passage of the Quran, is very much a central motif of, well, I would say it's not a central motif, it's a motif in the Muslim tradition. You could adhere to the core of Islam if you don't have this notion. Well, I could go on and on about this, but I mean, a central motif of Islam, where I think you couldn't be a Muslim if you didn't believe it, is the Shahada, the basic Muslim confession of faith. There's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That's it. Now, what does God mean? What does it mean that Muhammad was a messenger, etc.? That completely can apply to different understandings of Islam. So the distinction between core and periphery, let me use those words, has enormous implications for every tradition.
Thanks for the lecture. My question is, I think either the secular discourse or the religious discourse, when they arises, they try to organize human's life as a whole. That means they have a holistic desire to encompass every pieces of a personal and society lives in a holistic way, coherently, consistently. So empirically speaking, I think that the example you poses can be confirmed. People can indeed, in different relevant structure, in different periods of life, in different values of life. But doesn't it mean that this empirically confirmed fact should be rationally acknowledged or intellectually recognized? My meaning is, like for elite intellectual person, his personal belief is really committed to a specific tradition. Once he faces a concrete challenge from the modern technology and political discourse, does not he try to integrate his traditional belief with this secular discourse and try to form a holistic view of his life in a new way? So in this, I just wondering, the paradigms you imposes is just a descriptive paradigm which try to depict the status quo of human society now, or you think that you have some normative motive? You claim this paradigm is people should maintain this paradigm regardless of any person who cannot integrate his personal philosophy, and so there's no way to improve this paradigm. I don't know whether I can express my question.
No, I think you're expressing it very well. Look, anyone who has a strong religious faith, of whatever kind, will interpret his whole life in those terms, and insofar as he can, try to live by that understanding. But that doesn't mean that he can have no other thoughts, no other relevances, to put it this way. And look, I come back to my Orthodox Jewish surgeon, He knows I told him once what I thought about him, and he wasn't offended. He agreed. Look, I think I don't know him personally, but I know him as a doctor, and I would imagine other patients have remarked, we talk to each other waiting in the waiting room, and he's unusual. I mean, he's very warm. He's concerned with the individual problems he's interested in what they are doing. I had to tell him about my work. And does that have anything to do with his religion? I think yes. I mean, and he probably understands. I should interview him really and tape the interview. He probably understands his religion in terms of the Jewish concept with tikkun olam, the repair of the universe. It has a vocation to improve the nature of the universe. And kindness to one's fellow men is important. But nevertheless, so that all of his life is under that canopy. But at the moment of surgery, he has to think of something else. And I don't think that bothers him. And I don't see why it should. And the Schützian categories are very useful here. Yes.
Can I give another example? It relates to your answer, and it's about another medical professional. It's another story. So, I was talking to, she was a psychiatrist of mental health in Britain, and she was Chinese-born but lives in Britain, a doctor, and she was saying how important it is for her working in Birmingham to get to know the worldviews of different populations that she has referred to her. So she has to know, if a woman comes to her with a child and says, my daughter's being sick because she's possessed by jinn, she has to know, has to make a decision, is she suffering from a mental illness, the mother, or is this perfectly normal in that medical system where she comes from? And she understands, this person has to understand or get advice from colleagues from other cultures about those sorts of situations. And I said to her, do you think that the Western paradigm of dealing with mental health is superior to all these alternative views of mental health? And she thought about it for a long time. She was a Christian herself, actually. And she said, actually, no. They're just different. And they all have ways of dealing with things. So she was able, as a Christian, to situate herself in lots of other positions and see their merits, whilst only working in a Western scientific paradigm with a Christian faith.
No, that's a good example, yeah. And look, I mean, at least the three Abrahamic faiths, I mean, monotheistic faiths, as far as I know, a good Christian or Jew or Muslim would pray for healing. If you are sick or someone you care about is sick. But not all religious people of these traditions believe in miracles that can be produced through prayer. At least not visible miracles. Pentecostals do. In fact, that's one of their principal articles of faith, although they have different ways of interpreting this. Well, there's a difference between, say, my best friend is sick and I pray God should heal him, but I may mean that God should guide the hand of the surgeon, or God should work through the potency of some medication. Not that God will go boom and he will get up and walk out of the hospital. Okay? There are different ways of understanding divine actions in the world. That's pretty much your example, right?
Right. Yes. But the fact that she's in a pluralistic situation means that she is a Christian and a medical practitioner in a different way than she would be if she was in a mono
Yeah, that's true.
situation.
Yes. Fine.
Yeah.
But if she's a Chinese Christian, if not she, her parents or grandparents made the decision to be a Christian. Probably. very small Christian minority in China before modernization. Pluralization, I should say. Okay, we have about a couple more questions. Time? Yes?
So I think the second type of pluralism paradigm very interesting. So instead of thinking about multiple religions, we may think about that secular discourse coexist with multiple religions. So but my question is about the secular discourse. So it seems that it's easier for us to recognize different religious traditions, say Christianity, Buddhism, Islamic. But on the other side, for the maybe there are also multiple secular discourses. I was wondering whether you can help us to map out the different intellectual technologies of different kinds of secularism, such as enlightenment humanism, but there are other kinds of humanism, such as computationalism or even atheism. The different secularisms may have different approaches. And so the one question that how do we map out the intellectual technologies of different secularism? On the other hand, would you also help us to identify different institutions that help to shape different kinds of secular discourses? You mentioned the UN as well as different states. How about other important institutions that shape different kinds of secular universes or others? How do we make that balance?
That's an interesting question, and it was raised the other day by there's a journal in Washington, a magazine really, which I have a lot to do with because they administer my blog. It's called The American Interest. And the editor, who's, as far as I know, is not terribly religious, his name is Adam Garfinkel, he has a Jewish background, but I don't know much about his personal. But he raised the question, he asked me, he met some Saudi actually, who said he was an atheist. He couldn't say that in Saudi Arabia, but he can say it in Washington, and, without being killed. And Garfinkel asked me, is there a difference between atheism in a Muslim context and atheism in a Christian or Jewish concept? And I said, well, it's more a question, is it in the Abrahamic, monotheistic concept, or in a Buddhist or Hindu, for example, or Confucian context? And I think there is a difference, because if your faith involves a omnipotent and benevolent God, then the question of theodicy arises. Theodicy means an explanation of evil and suffering. If God is omnipotent and benevolent, how does he permit all the terrible things that happen to people, both performed by other people and performed by nature? That's a significant difference. And that's why Max Weber called Hinduism the most rational religion, because everything that happens to you is of nobody's fault except your own, the result of your karma, your previous lives. So if you were happy, healthy, and rich, you were a good person in your previous life, and if you were not, all these things happen to you now, and in your next life you'll be a bedbug. Don't blame anybody. There is no omnipotent God who's in charge of the play. That's a significant difference. Does it mean it's easier for a Buddhist society to deal with modernity? The evidence would say no. I think one more, and then I will have to give Professor Pollack a chance to say something. Jerry.
Not so much a question as a suggestion or an addendum to what you've written about pluralism. You distinguish a number of kinds of pluralism: religious pluralism, pluralism of secular discourse and religious discourses, and then pluralism within the human mind, as it were, of these coexisting secular and religious discourses. And you talked, discuss more in your book about the dialectic of relativization and fanaticism. It seems to me that kind of dialectic also goes on within different religious subgroups. That dialectic of recognition possibilities, together with a kind of defensiveness and attempt to reinforce one's own position. Something that you don't consider, but I think you might want to add, is a suggestion made about 10 or 15 years ago in a rather well-known article by Chaim Soloveitchik. He was writing about Orthodox Jews, but the point more broadly, and that is, with the extension of communication, you have a proliferation of texts and hence interpretations of the tradition, whereas in a traditional religious society you would probably have one dominant interpreter of the tradition. Now you have a much greater availability of interpretations of the religion, some of which lean towards leniency and some of which lean towards greater strictness and fanaticism. And when you put that seems to me to play also a role in, as I say, some of these dialectics of relativization and defensiveness.
Yes.
Now, if you're a Muslim living somewhere in the world, rather than just having your local imam as the interpreter of the tradition, you have 1,000 fatwas on the internet, some of which present a much more radical view of your faith. And this goes, of course, for any faith and subgroup of the faith. So that also creates a possible pull towards greater fanaticism.
Well, look, fanaticism is a pejorative term. Fundamentalism is less pejorative. People call themselves fundamentalists. Yeah, you mentioned Soloveitchik. I mean, what's the difference of being a Jew in 21st century United States and having been a Jew, I don't know, 200 years ago in the Pale of Settlement in Russia? There was not much choice to be a Jew in Imperial Russia 200 years ago. You may not like it, but there are few escapes from it if you were in that ghetto-type situation. What happens in places like Brooklyn, Williamsburg in America, or Mea Shearim in Israel, is a matter of choice. People typically come from the outside and decide to live there. They try to argue to themselves and to others that this is inevitable, this is their destiny. They've now discovered who they really are. Well, I don't want to quarrel with anybody's faith, but empirically speaking, that's not true. They made a choice, and they keep on making a choice. Now, let's take the case that you were born in Brooklyn, Williamsburg. Psychologically, it may be difficult to make a choice. This study that I mentioned before shows how difficult it is. But it can be done. And she describes the stages in which this is done. If you talk about men, they cut their side locks and they put on a baseball cap and they, I don't know, put on a jeans and take the subway to Manhattan. And in Mea Shearim, it's very similar. You start speaking Hebrew and you take a bus to Tel Aviv. It can be done, and people know that it can be done. And then the rabbis or whatever the authorities are, they say, no, you can't do it. That's not who you really are. Well, whatever your theology may be, empirically speaking, they're wrong. You do have a choice. Maybe a difficult choice, but you have a choice. And I've talked for long enough. Detlef, it's all yours. Let's go to you. Can we have a short break? Yes, I don't see why not. Yeah, sure.